So now this will be video 2 for W. Bush. We're now dealing with Iraq. So 2 years after the 9/11 attacks, Bush will expand the war in the Middle East to Iraq. Saddam Hussein was still in power after the Persian Gulf War back in the 90s. After the whole Persian Gulf War, he was supposed to be subject to an annual inspection by UN forces, making sure that he wasn't developing weapons of mass destruction or biological weapons and so forth. Well, inspections go on for a couple of years, but eventually he stops them. So in the late 90s, he stops allowing the United Nations inspectors to come in, which made them highly suspect as a result. And so in 2003, we fear that Saddam Hussein might be helping the terrorists. Bush was told by the CIA and the military that Saddam Hussein, there's enough evidence to suggest that he might be manufacturing WMDs or weapons of mass destruction, and he might be helping give money and aid to the terrorists. You can see here Saddam Hussein's name, and there's Saddam right there. Now, he also referred to them as far as a part of this axis of evil. Iraq, Iran, and North Korea were part of what's called the axis of evil. 3 countries he considered the biggest threats to America. And so in March of 2003, he gives Saddam Hussein 48 hours to allow UN inspectors to come in or step down. Saddam Hussein doesn't comply, and so within 48 hours we begin attacks on Baghdad, and we start the Iraq War. This will not be UN approved. It'll be us, the British, and a few other countries that will help form a coalition to go into Iraq, but it's not like it was with Afghanistan. Within 21 days, we bring down the government, and we bring down Saddam Hussein's government. By the end of the year in December, we've captured him. So Saddam Hussein's captured in this little hole, hiding about a year later, and he's given over to the Iraqi people. He's put on trial, and he's eventually executed. So he's dead now, but he was tried by the Iraqi courts, not by us, for his crimes, mostly because of some of the things he did back in the 80s, killing various groups in his country. But after fighting there, we searched for years. We never find any weapons of mass destruction, at least not to what we thought there were. There's been some evidence since then, more recently, suggests that there might have been some things, but nothing to the degree we thought. And at least, the CIA and the military misled Bush and, what they believed was there to go in the first place. And a lot of critics were upset about Iraq because it was the whole basis of the war. This is why Iraq is much more controversial, is because of the issue over these weapons of mass destruction not being there, and we never find any conclusive evidence suggesting that Iraq and Saddam Hussein were directly funding terrorism. So there's never any evidence that shows much of the WMDs or direct connections with terrorism. But at the very least, we did remove this brutal dictator from power, and now they have a democratic government, and they do enjoy more freedoms there. But in recent years, because of some of the harsher punishments harsher treatment that the new government has done to some groups in Iraq, it led to ISIS here recently. Now, we will get out of Iraq in 2011. That was one of Obama's promises. We got out of Iraq in 2011, so we're done in Iraq. But it has led to ISIS or ISIL or whatever you want to call them. And but the Iraq War was much more hated because people felt like it was just over oil there. It wasn't really about the people there or trying to liberate them or WMDs. And then we never go after Iran or North Korea, so just the whole thing was kind of left a bad taste in people's mouths. Then the war in Afghanistan. All right, one result of all this was Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. The base, of course, has been there for 100 years, but in the wake of 9/11, we put a detention center there in 2002 to hold people that we detain in these wars. So made in 2002 to house extraordinary, dangerous people, to interrogate them, to prosecute them. It was very controversial in the 2000s because they found out that, of course, they were doing things like waterboarding the prisoners and doing things that were a bit too harsh on them. And so there's been calls for it to close for the past several years. Obama promised to close it in 2008. He's yet to do so. But the detention center still exists because the thing is, no one wants to bring them to their state in America to be tried because they don't want them in their home state. So that's the big problem. So but the detention center is still there. We're never going to close Guantanamo Bay base, but the detention center is the issue, is whether or not we should close that, and if the methods we used to get information out of these people was useful. So Bush does win re-election in 2004, this time with no problems as far as the controversy. But in that first year of his second term, Hurricane Katrina hits. So in August of 2005, a Cat 3 hurricane goes through Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. And it seemed like everything was going okay that day until later that afternoon on that Sunday, the levees broke, which then puts 80% of New Orleans underwater and puts it in standing water, and it floods. A lot of people were trapped. And you know how Louisiana is. From our point of view, I mean, when hurricanes come, we know better. We were told to evacuate, but we don't. But there are a lot of people who didn't evacuate because the big one had never hit, but now it did. And so you have thousands of people who are trapped or people who need rescue. And this, the worst property damage itself was all through the Gulf Coast. It wasn't just New Orleans that was hit. It was hit Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. All the Gulf Coast was hit. And it's, millions of dollars of damage was done throughout all these different places and cities. But New Orleans, of course, becomes the big focus. There are people who die in the initial hurricane storm. So there are, hundreds of people who do die in the storms itself. But what's significant about Hurricane Katrina is that it was just a colossal failure of reaction at the local, state, and national level. So it wasn't just a federal disaster. It was a local, state, and national disaster. This was probably the biggest catastrophe in U.S. Army Corps of Engineer history because they had not adequately checked the levees, make sure they were strong enough to protect against this kind of problem. And there was a major lawsuit put against them for their lack of inspections. But you see, like the city government under Ray Nagin had a hard time getting control of the city and trying to get people out. The governor, Kathleen Blanco, and the state government did not do a great job of evacuating, and they kind of waited till the last minute to ask for evacuation help and to ask for federal relief help too. Bush, because he's president, bears a lot of blame for this, but I mean, it was partially his responsibility, partially state, partially city responsibility. FEMA, the organization that was put in charge of doing the cleanup, they're responsible too. But overall, just the way the whole storm and the aftermath was handled was not the best, and it really hurt the reputation of Bush that he never quite overcame for the remainder of his term. And of course, New Orleans and these other places are still dealing with the effects of Katrina, but those are the major issues there. Okay, so the last thing is the mortgage crisis and the recession in 2008. So in the 90s and in 2000s, you had a real estate boom. A lot of the restrictions on the real estate market were taken away by Clinton and the Republicans back in the 90s, which made it easier to get mortgages. And I mean like 100% finance mortgages, which means like you could buy a $400,000 house without having all the necessary money to kind of back it up with it. So maybe you can only afford $150,000, but you buy a $400,000 through a mortgage. And these mortgages, these banks were giving out were not great because the interest rates were adjustable, which means that once they got the mortgage bills, the bill could keep getting higher and higher if the interest rate goes up. So that's what ends up happening around 2007, 2008. People can't afford these homes in the first place. The bills adjust and they get bigger. And so they start foreclosing. So if enough people start foreclosing, the banks get hurt, which results in the bubble being burst. So in 2008, this whole financial crisis emerges because of this housing crisis, this housing market, because of these subprime mortgages. That's what they refer to as subprime mortgages. So if foreclosures increase, banks struggle as a result. A lot of businesses across the country will be hurt. You're going to see property values plummet. Investments slow. Businesses stop hiring people. There's a spending decline. Unemployment hits about 10% in this time period. So things get kind of tough for a while. And so the initial issue is that, the banks, have to readjust how they do mortgages. Like I said, people are losing their jobs and so forth, and it is a pretty hard recession for us, but not enough to probably call it the Great Recession, and as far as the severity of all this. But people really do get hurt by this in the meantime. But it's mostly caused, it affects some banks and affects some businesses. Some businesses are threatened with having to close because of the financial crisis, and that response from that is that the government does bailouts as a result. So in 2008, with the Democratic Congress and Bush, who's a Republican, they're going to do a bailout system using what's called TARP money. TARP was an acronym for the bailout money, but basically the federal government was going to give money to some businesses that were quote-unquote too big to fail to help prop them up. Now, since then, all the bailout money has been paid back, but some people felt like it was not fair that some of these companies got bailed out which increased the national debt, and it increased a lot of the, this idea that these guys can't fail and they can just keep doing these bad practices and so forth. But since then the money's been paid back, these businesses are still functioning. But this was the effort. Had Bush and Congress not done this, things would probably been a lot worse. But it does help to increase the national debt and the deficit spending as a result too, which doesn't help us at all in general. So Bush does get hurt by this last major crisis in 2008. And the 2008 election, this is going to be the main focus as far as topic is the economy. So we're going to stop there with the second Bush video, and that's all for W. Bush.